you.
Good morning, good afternoon, Machilo.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We are very, very honored and proud to have you with us. And we're looking forward to learning and engaging with you over the next hour. You're live,
Okay.
so you go. So as soon as you're ready.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for being part of this conversation. My name is Matilo Motsei. As they've already told you, I'm streaming in from Pretoria. It's very hot where we are. And my topic is basically to focus on why the silence around obstetric violence, why the silence around the violence that women go through during childbirth. When you look at the National Strategy Plan that is kind of put together to address gender-based violence, there is no mention of obstetric violence. There's no mention of violence that women go through during childbirth. But before I start with what I have prepared, maybe I could introduce myself a little bit so that you have a bit of a background of who I am, where I'm coming from. I started my career as a nurse and a midwife in rural Eastern Transvaal at the time, now Mpumalanga. It's interesting now that I have come full circle. My main area of work at the moment is integrating Indigenous knowledge systems in modern innovations. And I argue that Indigenous knowledge is knowledge. And most of the time when we speak about knowledge, we tend to view Indigenous knowledge as an add-on or a nice to have kind of a thing. We don't see it as knowledge that needs to be integrated into what we define as knowledge. Even in conversations around, excuse me, even in conversations around, decolonizing universities, there is no mention of Indigenous knowledge at the center. Indigenous knowledge is always in the margins. So I started my career as a nurse, midwife, obviously trained within the Western medical model. And the Western medical model's intention, even though it may be conscious, indirect, but the model's intention is to suppress our own knowledges, is to make us believe less in our ability to produce knowledge. It makes knowledge production very territorial, so that when we step into institutions of higher learning, we step into those institutions as aliens, as if we have got nothing to contribute to the discourse. So I'm a product of the Western medical training. Later on in my life, as I was called to healing, and I got more attracted into doing research on Indigenous knowledge, I retraced my steps to the time when I was training as a midwife in a rural hospital, and was shocked to find that the training that I received then made me a perfect vehicle for the perpetuation of the suppression of Indigenous midwifery, because we accept that what happens in the hospital is the norm, as an example. So I'm giving this background so that we understand that in my journey now, I'm doing my PhD research on Indigenous midwives as a counter to obstetric violence. And I'm working with rural midwives in Mpumalanga. So I'm telling the story so that you almost like journey with me as a product of Bantu education and then going through a Western medical model training that refuses to take anything from the knowledge or knowledges of my people. And then many years later, I'm back at the same area where I trained as a biomedical midwife, now doing research on Indigenous midwifery. The twist to that, in fact, is amazing that after training as a midwife, one of the things that we had to do was you were posted to a rural clinic. And the clinic where I was posted to is in a village called Zuknoch, which there's no lights. There was no electricity at the time. So we kind of perfected the art of supporting women giving birth at candlelight. And the twist to the plot is that many years later, when I became a healer, I was drawn to a river and a spiritual well, a spiritual source of water in a river and a mountain, not very far from that clinic where I practice as a biomedical midwife. So I kind of laugh about that, and I say, my ancestors have a wicked sense of humor, because that time when I was still young and I was practicing in that clinic, I was virtually a few kilometers away from the place where I was initiated. And had I known, I would have like just fast tracked the process, but life doesn't work like that. So back to the topic, breaking the cycle of obstetric violence. Until the 17th century, a little bit of global historical background, until the 17th century, birth was in the hands of women. And then from the early 19th century, medicine began to dominate birthing. During the time when birthing was in the hands of women, being pregnant was not a pathology, meaning that when you are pregnant, you are not sick. You don't necessarily need medical intervention, unless of course you have complications. But the advent of Christianity, some of the factors during that time was with the advent of Christianity, the model of healthcare at that time was based on the belief of the Catholic Church, which defined childbearing as suffering. During that time, because childbearing was a suffering, ironically, anyone who used drugs or anything to relieve pain during childbirth was rendered illegal. But later on, during the 19th century, when birthing began to move from the home to the hospital, when the birthing processes, which are natural, which are not pathological, began to be dominated by male obstetricians, during that time, then this is where, with the medicalization of childbirth, this is basically where the origins of obstetric violence started. The term obstetric violence, even though it was not used at that time, the notion of violence against women during childbirth started to emerge into the public space in the 1950s in a women's magazine in the US, a magazine called the Ladies' Home Journal. There was an article there called Cruelty in Maternity Ward. And in that article, there was a report about women who were giving birth, who were drugged with drugs like morphine. so that they are induced into deep sleep. Some of them suffered hallucinations because of the impact of the drugs, and some even experienced loss of consciousness. And to protect, obviously, when you lose consciousness, you are prone to injury. To prevent injuries, women who were giving birth, some of them were handcuffed to the bed to prevent them from falling. And many of them woke up from their unconscious state after giving birth, not even remembering what happened. The cervix would be dilated with instruments during that time when you are unconscious, and then the baby was yanked out of the body, the mother's body, with forceps. So this process of medicalization of childbirth, interestingly, came with a high degree of dehumanization of the woman's body. And it also suppressed the ability of the woman's body to give birth, because the woman's body has an innate knowledge. The woman's body knows how to give birth. So with medicalization, high medicalization, then that suppressed the body's knowledge to give birth. Obviously, then birthing became institutionalized and more, as we know now in the 21st century, it is more profit-driven. And during that time of the shift from the home to the hospital, the knowledge of women, the knowledge of midwives was suppressed, was rendered illegal. That was also at the time of the establishment of universities, and women were not allowed in universities, meaning that as a woman, as a midwife, you could have knowledge that has been birthing knowledge that has been passed on from generations, but because patriarchy disallows you as a woman to be trained, and the rules, the laws of the time were like, if you are not trained, you cannot practice as a birthing practitioner. So that was the beginning of the silencing of the knowledge of women. It was the beginning of the suppression and isolation and marginalization of midwives. And it was also the time where nursing's position began to be shifted and to be seen and perceived to be inferior to medicine. So with that then came, with institutionalization, obviously it came with obstetric violence. The term obstetric violence originates from a long history of Latin American women's activism for respectful birth. And then initially, there was this agreement in using the term obstetric violence because people felt that it would upset the relationship with medical practitioners. And there was a feeling that individual malpractice will cause hostility. But over time, the term was used. At the moment, there isn't a single term, there isn't a single definition that describes what obstetric violence is, but there's a kind of a taxonomy of activities, a variety of activities that are described as obstetric violence or violence that women go through during childbirth. Obviously, there's overt violence, physical violence. A lot of women that I'm interacting with in the villages right now in Mpumalanga, prefer or choose to have unassisted births at home, especially now during COVID-19. But one of the reasons why they choose to have home births is because they are being assaulted, is because they are subjected to violence in institutionalized birthing situations like in hospitals. Another form of violence is verbal, disrespected, called names, emotional abuse, or even sexual. If you consider an experience of when you are giving birth as a woman, you are at your most vulnerable. And imagine a situation where you are lying there on the bed, on your back, with your legs on stirrups or not, but legs up. And imagine a situation also where an obstetrician is taking some interns on, on a ward round, and you become a specimen, and you have to undergo unnecessary vaginal examinations. One thing that I'm finding interesting and fascinating in my conversation with rural women who are facilitating birthing at home, I asked them a question specifically: how do you know that the woman is ready to give birth? Do you do vaginal examinations? And all of them says no. There are certain signs that they know, that they can see. But also what they do is that they check. They just check. Once the head crowns, they know that the woman is ready to give birth. So it's interesting for me to find out that women go through labor, who have babies at home, they go through labor without having to undergo vaginal examinations. Other forms of violence that women are subjected to, women who are giving birth are subjected to, is failure to meet professional standards. For example, lack of privacy. We know in our hospitals, especially public hospitals, there's overcrowding, there's no privacy, and also the language that is used to communicate with us most of the time is a language that we don't understand. I may be understanding English, but if I'm not trained in the medical field, for instance, it's easy for me to be in a hospital and just feel at a loss and have people talk around me about me without understanding anything. So there's different points in which a woman who is giving birth can kind of experience violence. One point could be at the interaction with a healthcare provider. I've already said physical violence, verbal, sexual. So that kind of individual woman healthcare provider kind of violence. That's one way in which a woman can be subjected to violence. The other way in which women can be subjected to violence is systemic failure in healthcare services. We are going through a phase in this country where almost everything is falling apart. So imagine what it's like for a woman who can't speak for herself, who does not even understand the language. Imagine what it's like for her to give birth in a hospital during these kind of times. Imagine the kind of violence that she is subjected to. She may not suffer physical violence. She may not be verbally abused. She may not be sexually abused. But the system itself, it's alienating. Birthing itself, it's foreign and it's alienating and has the potential to become violent. Another way in which a woman can be subjected to violence is what is termed structural violence, which arise out of common conditions that we deal with in our country: extreme poverty, health inequity, patriarchy, all of that are just factors that makes the woman prone to violence during childbirth. So just maybe to end up so that we interact. I think I will be able to share more from questions from the room, is that I can talk about maybe one definition of obstetric violence, which originates in Venezuela, and it has been adopted by many countries. They define obstetric violence as appropriation of women's bodies and reproductive processes by health workers, which is expressed by a dehumanizing treatment, abuse of medicalization and pathologization of natural processes, which result in loss of autonomy and loss of ability to decide freely about your body as a birthing woman. So if you think about it, if we consider this expansive definition that your woman's body and reproductive processes are appropriated by the Western medical care system, and in a high-tech environment, that appropriation is even more. We think it's okay. High-tech medicine for us is normalized. It's actually the best kind of medical intervention. But then how does high-tech medicine appropriate your body, your reproductive processes when you are giving birth? Does it appropriate it or not? Does it dehumanize you? Meaning that as a woman who's giving birth, are you at the center of the birthing process? Or it's just your body? It's just your body that is pushing out a baby that's there. What about the whole of you as a woman? Do you feel dehumanized by the process? And then another thing is, if all of that resulting in loss of autonomy, do we have autonomy when we birth in like a hospital? Do we have a say? Do we have an ability to decide freely about, how we want to see birthing progress? The difference with home birth, for instance, is that when you give birth at home, a simple thing like the position that you choose to adopt when you are birthing a baby. In hospital, it's normal, it's a rule. You have to lie on your back on a bed. But then when you give birth at home, you can choose to squat. Many women that I'm interacting with, it's amazing that when they demonstrate to me how they give birth, and they believe that the body knows how to give birth to a baby. What I have found amazing is how many of them, as I have alluded to earlier, how many of them know how to give birth on their own, have unassisted birth. The grandmothers and the mothers teach you, for instance, that if you're alone and the hospital is far off, and you come to a place where you are about to give birth, this is what you should do. This is what you should get. And even when the baby is out, they even teach you how to measure where to cut the umbilical cord and where you tie it. The amazing thing for me is also about practices around the placenta. Many of us have given birth in hospitals and we don't even know that we have a right to ask for a placenta. If you want to do rituals at home, the one thing that the interesting story that I want to share, and I'll end here and take questions, interesting story that I want to share is around placental care. There are practices, there are rituals that are put in place when the placenta is buried in the earth. Firstly, the placenta is buried in the earth to center us, moving from the first home, which is the womb, to being buried. So your home, which was inside your mother's womb, is buried in the earth, inland, as a way of centering you. And there are rituals. In fact, last month when I was out there, an old woman taught me a song that we sing. And the rituals also, some of them are done with particular phases of the moon. And I find that to be fascinating, that our people knew the link between, the celestial bodies, birthing, and our livelihood. For instance, during the ceremony where a baby is like taken out of the birthing heart, the children around will be taught a song, and they'll sing that song to the full moon. And the message in the full moon is, the message to the full moon is, make the moon your friend. So from a very early age, imagine this, you are being dragged out. There's a way in which a baby is taken out of the house after 2 months or 3 months, you're being dragged out. And then there's other children singing this song that speaks about the connection to the moon. And this is how we are reintroduced into earth, into the world. So yeah, this is the contrast between home birth, which also draws from the knowledge of Indigenous midwives, contrasting that with high-tech birthing in hospital. Another thing that happens in high-tech birthing, even if not high-tech birthing, is episiotomy, the cutting of the perineum to make room for the baby's head to come out, is taken as a standard, as a norm. But that is not something that should be taken as a norm. So it's something that is done without consent. So as I end, I want us to ponder over this question, and then I'll also take questions from you. What does consent mean for us as women who are giving birth? Most of the time when we speak about consent, it's only during debates and discussions around rape and sexual violence. What does consent mean during labor? And also, why the silence on violence against women during childbirth? Because it is a form of gender-based violence. It's happening to women because of their gender. So it's a form of gender-based violence. Why are we not speaking about it? Why is it not included in the strategy documents, in national strategy documents? Why is it that we have normalized it? We have normalized the fact that when you go to the hospital to give birth, you're going to be abused anyway, so it's okay. And we always say, as long as I'm healthy and the child is healthy, that's fine. So we normalize different forms of violence and abuse that happens to women during childbirth. So in my conversation with a lot of women, I am finding that because we have normalized that kind of violence, many of us are going through the abuse without speaking out about it, because we think it can't be avoided. I mean, if you are raped, you go to the police station to report. when you are abused during childbirth, where do you go? Because there is no accountability in our country also in terms of the kind of care that the majority of people are subjected to. So let me end here and then take questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Machilo. Thank you, Machilo, for the range of questions that you've opened for us. Okay. So we have one question here.
Hi, my name is Abigail, and since we're talking about high-tech medicine and consent, I was pondering about something I read once about how the vaccines is being tested on African orphans and puppies and rats and things like that, and how being like the vaccine being made mandatory and how consent works in that. Could we not essentially what I'm just kind of throwing out thoughts for you to discuss around consent and dehumanization of the human body in terms of mandatory vaccines. So I'm just kind of curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you. We have another question. Shall I take 2 or 3 and then wait for a response, Machilo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Moiketsi. So I wanted to find out with regards to the woman that you've been speaking with when conducting your research. And I think I want to link it to the issue around consent. So, and then earlier on you mentioned that, you know, childbirth is a woman's time when they're most vulnerable. So I wanted to find out from you, do you think the presence of a father or of a man in general who birthed the baby as well, or who fathered the child, do you think the presence of a father is vital in order to create healthy emotional bonds, or it doesn't matter at all, like with regards to the woman that you've interviewed? Sort of like interested to find out from them whether in terms of consent of the people who they want when they're giving birth, has the mentioning of the partner important or not? Thanks.
Thank you. One more. Here's another question.
Thank you, Machilo. I just thinking about the question of, you know, what is consent, especially in medicine. I thank you for the presentation, because I never really thought of the violence that happens to women giving birth as a form of gender-based violence, but it definitely is something that to think about. And then, you know, the conversations of consent within medicine also becomes very important. And I was wondering if, you know, we can begin to speak about consent in that space, or actually any other space, from a space of empathy and, you know, humanity, because I'm thinking that, you know, especially when you're undergoing an operation, the contract that you'll maybe sign will say that in order to absolve the institution, there'll be a clause that says that, you know, doctors are allowed to take any measure necessary to save whatever they deem necessary to save your life on the table, or whatever's necessary, and whatever's a very broad range, you know. So if you're undergoing maybe some surgery and then something goes wrong and then they have to cut your arm and you're subconscious, they're gonna have to amputate your arm if that's what saves your life, you know. But I think that when we have people in these spaces who are really empathetic and conscious about how the cutting of your arm will affect your life going forward, then I think that we have people who will be more invested to finding other ways to solve the situation that is not maybe as quick as amputation. So I don't know if to talk about consent is to also talk about empathy, you know, for the next person who you're dealing with as a doctor to patient. And another question is, I wanted to ask if any of the women who you've interviewed have said anything about how the way that they were treated in hospital has, so I just wonder, you know, what contributes to postpartum depression. And I was wondering if you've interviewed any women who've spoken about that and who've spoken about how the violence that they've endured giving birth has affected their relationship with their child.
Thank you. Thanks,
Okay.
Angela.
All right, I'll start with the last question. The impact of mistreatment on the relationship with the baby. I haven't found any information on that. But the thing about postpartum depression is also that in Indigenous terms, birthing is a social event. It's not something that you go through alone. For instance, you would be in a room surrounded by at least 2 or 3 women. And that in itself, even though because of physiological or biochemical changes, you can be prone to depression. The fact that you have support and that you are not alone is something that helps with the depression. A woman who has just given birth is taken care of by a community of women, and that helps to kind of prevent the possibility of postpartum depression. But in terms of those who have experienced violence in hospital, they stopped going to hospitals. There's many who have their first experience of birthing, including someone who is a medical practitioner. This is not just women. Someone who is a medical practitioner who went to a hospital was subjected to extreme form of verbal abuse and neglect. And then she decided, she's got 3 kids. She decided that the next 2 children she's going to have at home with the help of a midwife. So what I have found is that women who have experienced violence in hospital stop going to hospital. They choose to have home births as a result to avoid being subjected to violence. And the issue about consent, it's interesting that you make a comparison of birthing and the amputation of the arm. You know, I find that interesting. Birthing is not a pathology. Unless you have complications, it's not a pathology. It's not something that needs a hectic medical intervention. So I found your question interesting because somehow it, for me, I may be wrong, it just reveals how in our heads we situate birthing in the hospital. Even when we speak about consent, we are incapable of thinking about consent as in choosing the position that you want to give birth in. So I think, you know, that question of consent is very revealing. And in a case of a hospital, let's say there's complications and as a woman, you have to go for a cesarean section. Yes, that has to be taken into consideration. Then your point of empathy comes in. But in addition to that, your point of informed, I mean, the consent must be informed, meaning that you have to be told what you are consenting to. But usually what happens in hospitals, even to some of us who kind of describes ourselves as educated, you know, it's amazing that when you get into the hospital, you hand over yourself to healthcare providers. And there's a voice in you that kind of stops you from asking the questions, because asking questions a lot is going to get you into trouble. And that is something to be aware of. One of the things one of the findings of research that was done by Rachel Chadwick in hospitals around the Western Cape, she identified something like silence as a weapon. That the woman who is giving birth in a hospital or in a clinic enters that space knowing that I must be as as silent and compliant as possible to make it easy for myself to give birth and leave. So silence, also women who give birth in a hospital know that this is kind of a territory that can't be questioned. So they end up being silent. And even when they bring a consent form for you to go to a cesarean section, even when there is no indication for a cesarean section, you just sign, because we operate in a place of silence, which comes out of fear, which originates from the authoritative nature of medicine, which has got elements of colonization and patriarchy into it. And then, Moeketsi, your question, the role of the father. Traditionally, birthing is a women's space. In a healing heart, there would be, as I have described earlier, there would be maybe 3-4 women who are supporting this woman in giving birth. But in a case, like for instance, my psychology honors thesis many years ago was about the role of the father in childbirth. Yes, I think there is a role of the father in childbirth. Obviously, say for instance, you have a home birth and there's a midwife, you would be working with that midwife as a couple, because you also need to know, you also need to be prepared as to what to expect and how you support your partner. But something that I find very fascinating about the role of the father is in naming ceremonies. In the time when there's also the thing about when the baby comes, they are not given a name immediately, and there's different reasons why they are not given a name immediately. One of the reasons could be they want to see if this soul that has come through wants to stay for longer, or just wants to come in and check out and find local government elections in a mess and decide that I'm ducking out. So they want to first check if the soul is here to stay before they give it a name. Another reason could be they want to see who this soul reminds them of, because they have to name this baby after someone. Thirdly, there is a notion of a baby cries for a name. The old woman was saying that a baby will be crying endlessly, and then the old woman would say, "Who are you? Are you Matsilo?" And then the baby continues to cry, "Are you Moeketsi?" And the baby just continues to wail, "Are you Abigail?" And then silence. So in a sense, they believe that the baby cries for a name. But in the naming ceremony, when the baby is taken out of the heart, the first person who whispers the name of the baby in the baby's ear is the father. And what you do as the father, you also do the family praise poem, the clan names. The first experience of hearing your clan name, hearing the family praise poem, is when your father whispers that in your ear. So I think it's also a fascinating discovery that I'm finding in terms of the role of the father. Now think about the migrant labor system, where the fathers are not there, and what's the impact, of not having your father being the first person to whisper your clan name in your ear. So there's very serious cultural impacts that comes from our loss of knowledge. Abigail, in terms of vaccines, I don't know. I would say that I really don't know. I haven't done any work on that. I haven't done any reading, so I wouldn't risk giving a response to that. And maybe people in the room can take that question up. You may discuss it as a group.
Thank you, Machilo. Do we have other questions? Yvette?
Hi, Machila, how are you doing?
I was wondering, I saw the back of your head and I know your hair. I know your hair, you know.
Thanks for an amazing paper, and I'm really so glad that you are pursuing this line of inquiry. And one of the things I really like is the way you group different forms of violence, obstetric violence, so that we can link it to a broader GBV scholarship. I guess one thing that you're really making clear for me that I hadn't thought about very systematically, but it's leaping out of your paper, is the epistemicide, the loss of ritual.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's that we're so used to that loss that we barely note it. It's so normalized, but to me it seems to be a huge and gaping wound in our psyche. You know, and is that not a form of violence maybe that we need to name?
Definitely. I mean, Black scholars, Black academics, researchers can tell stories about the violence that they suffer in what we call institutions of higher learning, where you are forced to fit in a particular way of thinking, where what is not knowledge. And I think what I'm finding very, very frustrating is, you know, how, as you say, we have normalized epistemicide. The Western education system that we are going through makes us indifferent to our knowledge, either indifferent or we see it as inferior. I could be an advocate for decolonization, but I would still not advocate for an inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. What I have found in my research, for instance, that feminists who began to advocate for a return of birthing practices, natural birthing practices, feminists globally had been very vocal to advocate for that, but none of them advocate for Indigenous midwifery knowledge, none of them. So it's interesting that even amongst us, there are some feminists who will advocate for natural birthing, advocate for women-centered birthing, but it is still within the Western model, is still within the biomedical system of healthcare. But there is no way, I haven't found a way, kind of evidence of feminists advocating for Indigenous midwives. In the case where feminists and healthcare practitioners in this country have done research on Indigenous midwifery, is most of the time is to reinforce how dangerous it is not to follow the rule of Western medicine, how dangerous birthing is and how dangerous it is to even think about giving birth at home. I must say I'm becoming astounded at the number of women that I'm interacting with who give birth at home. You know, and what is fascinating is also that after giving birth, they take the baby to the clinic for one thing only, just so that they get a letter to go and register the baby at the Home Affairs. Because if they don't have a letter from the clinic, then there's trouble. So they only go to the clinic for that. After having given birth, cleaned their baby, taken them there for them to check. But also the nurses at the clinic or at the hospital will record that birth as them having supervised it. They do not record it as a home birth. And that also continues to collude with the belief and the notion that giving birth at home is dangerous. And the only safe way of giving birth is in a high-tech medical setting.
We have one more question.
I wanted to, so you spoke about the appropriation of women's bodies. And I'm now thinking about how some of the presentations during the week have been on art. And we know that art, you know, part of art is to provoke. And I wanted to find out from you, what do you think about, you know, so speaking about the whole appropriation of women's bodies, but in the form of art. And I'm thinking here about the artist, and I'm not sure if you know about his name, but again, he goes by, I think, Lil Nas X. So he's a Black American gay male rapper, and he released his album, and the cover art was of him being pregnant. So he used like a prosthetic. So there was a whole conversation around, so it's art, you know, he's allowed to express himself in a manner that he wants. There were those who felt like, you know, he was mocking pregnancy and so on and so on. So I think I wanted to find out from you, what do you think should be the boundary between, if there should be, you know, the lived experience of childbirth or pregnancy and art? Yeah.
I think I'll answer your question in an indirect way. If you look at an issue like sexual pleasure, I have written quite a few stories around women and sexual pleasure and erotica. If you check what's mainly in the public space, it's women's sexual pleasure as defined by men. And I have found amazing texts, mainly by women in Latin America, who turn things around, who sexualize almost everything. You know, they would look at a cross on top of a church, and they would like write poetry or a vignette or a story about that cross, but sexualizing it in such a way that they take their power back from talking about, you know, sex. So I think you asked a question and you answered yourself as well when you spoke about boundaries. And you said, where do you think there should be a boundary, if there should be any? I don't think that there should be a boundary, especially that we live in a society with kind of a vast experience of gender identities. I think we live in an era and time where all of that can be explored. It would be interesting, for instance, you giving me an idea, it would be interesting that what would be a way of turning some of my findings into art, maybe working with a playwright and doing a play around some of the findings as an example. It's something that could be interesting. But another point around art is an issue of architecture, because architecture is also a form of art. The way that hospitals have been designed are not designed for childbirthing as a social event. They are designed for childbirthing almost like women come in and out. There's a bed for you, you give birth, then you move to another room, then you go home. As many women come in as possible. The more I identify these birthing rituals from the elders, the more I look at the way the architecture of the hospital, and I have concluded that the architecture of the hospital is not appropriate. If I'm going to be part of creating a holistic birthing space, that would be designed differently. A lot of the rooms, for instance, would be circular, not square, in terms of the significance of the circle in African cosmology. A lot of the rooms would be in such a way that if you want to give birth if you are giving birth and you want to bring your grandmother to chant when you are pushing the baby out, to chant your ancestral names and invoke the spirits. If you want to bring your grandmother, you can bring her with, but you can't do that in a hospital as it is designed now. But if you've designed round huts where when the grandmother is tired, can go and lie down after you have pushed the baby out. So that's also another way in which art has to be considered in reconfiguring a holistic way of giving birth. My dream actually is to, when I'm done, my dream is to create what I call a birthing village. A village where I envisage a baby being born to the sound of drums and incantations from their elders. And it can be a collaboration, and it should be a collaboration between Indigenous and biomedical midwives, because I don't want us to be saying, no, we don't want, biomedical birthing. There is time when there is that is required. But my dream is to have that space where, imagine coming out of your mother's womb to the sound of drums and incantations, and the placenta that you inhabited for 9 months is buried in the land to center you. And when things go hard, in Setswana, "Khubjana ya gago," they do say, "Khubjana ya gago e bolokilwe kae?" Where is the stump of your umbilical cord buried? And that becomes a special place, a connection between you and land. We are calling for the return of land, but we have not yet found a way of linking birthing women's bodies, indigenous rituals, and using that to heal our relationship with land. Being taken away from land in the way that we have has also impacted on the way that we give birth, has impacted on the loss of information, as Yvette speaks about epistemic. Loss of land has come with a loss of knowledge.
Thank you, Mashilo. We are at the end of the session. I have a lot of questions around modernity and progress in biomedicine and how your study reveals the fantasy of it, the fantasy of modernity, the fantasy of progress, and how these multiple kinds of dispositions are interlinked. But thank you very, very much for a session that's not just been informative, but has offered us a beautiful dream right at the end of different possibilities. And I think that's an amazing place to end off. And we're looking forward to your keynote tomorrow, where I'm sure we'll touch on some more of these issues. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So a reminder to everybody, we're going on our lunch break from 1 till 3, and afterwards we'll return with a panel on solidarity in the politics of care. We'll also have some video artwork and a panel on claiming breath and gaze later, and the final panel on feminism and the archive. And a reminder that we'll also meet Sophie Peters tomorrow again in the Art on Our Mind Creative Dialogue. Thank you very, very much.